Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Southpaw. This is a movie that ultimately, right at the second of this recording, you can see on Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service that at the end of the day, you can just go out of your way to just go in and just basically just watch everything for absolutely free with absolutely no fees to ultimately go and see any movies that you want. By golly, go ahead and do so. But also, you can go and see this for free on Amazon if you want. I believe it's free right now. You could also probably see it on like any other number of things. But anyways, so what is this movie about? In a very cryptic like sense, and then we'll go into spoilers here shortly. So this movie is about a character coming from a undefeated streak to now a comeback streak or a comeback. Um, we end up having a person seemingly undefeated as if he was bulletproof, and we end up finding out that ultimately that is not exactly true. That ultimately there is something that is going to end up causing him to not quite be as bulletproof as he thinks. And then eventually we end up having this character fall apart to try to put the pieces back together again. And I think that is the most interesting thing about this movie is we have a character that ultimately we kind of have very little backstory of this character, which ultimately I wish there was a little bit more of a backstory where like we kind of have it to where this guy well, I guess this is kind of like a rags to riches to rags kind of thing, and we end up having it to where seemingly uh, Billy Hope has pretty much almost lost all hope to the point of him just trying to find quite possibly like-minded people that ultimately he could just kind of just justify his existence to. So, or ultimately just find the right people, because it seemed that ultimately he was maybe, while looking twice at it, it seems like there was a lot of people in his life that were just waiting for the pen to drop to f him over, um, to basically have it to where, okay, well, since now, like, this is the prime time to take advantage of this guy, let's go ahead and do so. Um, and then he's going to realize uh, how reasonably sad that, or he's going to realize how really bad these people were, when ultimately he is not their prime stallion anymore, so to speak, in the landscape of things. So yeah, I thought that this movie was really good. I really enjoyed it. I also watched like some featurettes and stuff like that um, of ultimately both uh, Jake Gyllenhaal and the director trying as much as humanly possible to train for this movie. It seems like the director was also training uh, to be a boxer with Jake Gyllenhaal, um, which I thought was really fascinating. I was like, oh my god, like, so we have this director that ultimately doesn't need to do this training, but he's doing it anyways to have the real support um, of his main character, which is ultimately Jake Gyllenhaal. I think ultimately when watching this movie, I was just real impressed by uh, ultimately there seemingly being the right people in the right places. There was never really one character where I could say it's like, man, if they would have casted this other person, it would have been way better. Um, I don't feel like that was done at all during this movie, where I could just counter to pick different actors. So let's go into ultimately going into spoilers about this movie. Let's go and just talk about it, because ultimately at the end of the day, there's only so much I could say in a very cryptic like sense. Comeback trail, yeah, it's a comeback trail for this undefeated person that ultimately loses in some way. So let's go out our way. to ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil Southpaw. So, we ultimately have it to where in the very beginning of this, we ultimately have seemingly a Jake Gyllenhaal character, Billy Hope, that seems to be undefeated. It seems that this guy otherwise tends to take a lot of punches. We end up having to where Billy in this boxing match is getting clocked. Ultimately, to where uh, Billy isn't even defending himself. He's like, "Come on, frickin' hit me!" And so basically, we end up having it to where after this matchup, to where ultimately Billy is to win. We end up having it to where Marlene is ultimately kind of just very worried about where Billy is going to end up after these matches. Like, basically, he's going to be punch drunk within the next 2 years because he is just consistently getting hit after hit after hit instead of defending himself. So we eventually have it to where Billy is like, God, this is something that you tell people when they lose, not something that you tell people when they win. Because ultimately, Billy is undefeated so far. So we end up having it to where eventually the next contestant that is to go to get to get Billy Hope's belt is Miguel Escobar. And it seems that this guy is talking a lot of smack, trying to find every single place where ultimately Billy Hope is at, to ultimately say, like, dude, I'm going to take your belt from you, like, I'm going to beat you, so on and so forth. Um, Ultimately, we end up having it to where Billy Hope ends up getting frustrated, and ultimately he's like, dude, I want this fight. I want this match with this guy to just shut him up. Um, and so ultimately they end up going and booking the match, and ultimately Marlene is just like, you know what, I think we need to just take a break for a while. Like, I think like we've just been kind of going at this way too hard. So we end up having it to where eventually to where ultimately Billy is to go to a fundraiser to ultimately support orphans because eventually he is to do a entire speech where he is talking about how he met a girl years ago that ultimately her hair was ratty and stuff like that, and ultimately he was to mention how many numerous times he had probably gotten incarcerated, and ultimately all these things to ultimately um, kind of have people ultimately kind of feel for him, that ultimately he had troubled beginnings and stuff like that. Ultimately saying how this environment that he had went in had given him his first ever pair of gloves or boxing gloves. Ultimately, they were tattered and ratty and whatever, but they were his. Ultimately, we end up having to, or after this speech is over, that ultimately Escobar is to go and try to talk to Billy Hope yet again to ultimately get this match signed. Ultimately, to tell him, dude, I'm going to take your wife and then I'm going to take your belt, and all kinds of things to get Billy upset. So we end up having it to ultimately Billy is to grab onto Escobar and eventually have this fight right here and there, which ultimately is going to cause any number of people to just start pandemonium, just start scrambling. And so we end up having it to where eventually one of Escobar's goons ends up pulling out a gun to ultimately fire, and that bullet is to end up hitting Billy Hope's wife, Marlene Hope. Ultimately, to where she is to go down. Ultimately, to where Billy is now scrambling to get to her to ultimately seemingly have the last moments of her before, or last moment with her before she ends up dying. Ultimately, trying to put pressure on the wound, but then again, it seems that Marlene is far too gone to be able to do any number of things. So eventually, Billy's just going to try and comfort her before she ends up dying. So we end up having it to where Billy is taking this, of course, the death of his wife, really hard. We end up having it to where Layla Hope is ultimately to seemingly not really be like. It seems like Layla to, or it seems that Billy to Layla is kind of a ghost person. Like, yeah, he's like she's seen him on TV, and it seems that ultimately uh, she has spent time with him, but really she doesn't know him whatsoever. Because ultimately it just seems like there's a really a disconnect there. And eventually we have it to where ultimately Billy wants to go and try to end up killing the guy, then end up trying to go uh, after his wife. We end up having to where Billy is trying to search out and try to find this guy who had killed his woman, but while he ends up trying to do that, he ends up realizing how much a mistake that was to attempt to do that, because we find out how much the bottom of the barrel of these people's lives are, that ultimately he is going to go and pull a gun into their lives. So we end up having it to where eventually Billy is to slowly but surely realize within his fight promoter that ultimately they are wanting to, as quickly as humanly possible, sign him for another fight. Because ultimately he is starting to really lose all of his money. It seems that ultimately uh, they find out, or Billy finds out that ultimately he's like, well, hey, why don't I just have why not just pay whatever off? Like, I have money, pay it off. And ultimately the attorney's like, yeah, you don't have any money. So we end up having it to where ultimately Billy is to be forced to fight yet again, and this is not really the perfect time. Ultimately, every single time Billy is to go and fight this guy, he's looking to see Marlene in the stands, which ultimately is really not going to be a thing. So we eventually have it to where Billy is going and fighting this guy that he doesn't want to fight. And ultimately, we eventually have it to where his coaches end up throwing the towel on the match because it's like, dude, this guy is gone. Like, this guy is not here. Um, like, so we end up having it to where ultimately Billy is to lose because of forfeit, and so ultimately we are to have Billy go into the shower, ultimately calling for somebody that doesn't exist. Um, he's ending up calling for anybody, and there's nobody there for him after the fight. Everybody has left him. Everybody has left his side. Nobody wants to be there to otherwise take off his socks, and so he's dipping himself into the shower to take a shower, and reasonably he's taking a shower with his socks on. So we end up having it to eventually Billy Hope is to try and crash his car into a tree and eventually end up going home to have his daughter find him and to eventually call for anybody to help. So we eventually find out that Billy ends up losing the custody of his. He ends up losing the custody of his daughter. He ends up also seemingly is going to lose his home because he can't afford to have the upkeep of it, and also during that match that ultimately was being thrown out uh, by his coaches, towards the very tail end of that fight, Billy Hope ends up punching the referee in the face to where he ends up breaking his nose, I guess. So we basically have it to where Billy is going to quite possibly be sued. It seems that ultimately all of his uh, accounts and everything like that are going to get frozen. And so Billy is basically like, well, I got nothing. Like, dude, I was a undefeated boxer and now I'm nothing. How awful is that? And so ultimately we have it to where reasonably Layla is to be sent off to an orphanage Um, and so we end up having it to where Billy is to basically find another home for him and his future daughter when eventually he wins her back, to live in. And so while that is going on, we end up having to where Billy Hope has to find employment because it's not like uh, his manager Jordan Maines is going to be forking over any money that Billy hasn't accumulated by fighting. So we end up having it to ultimately Billy needs a job. Ultimately, he had lost his license of being a pro fighter, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Billy goes and needs to train to be a boxer because that's all he wants to do with his life. And so we end up having to where Billy Hope goes to Tick Wills, who it seems that Tick Wills was the only person or the only trainer that ultimately Billy Hope liked because seemed that when Billy Hope had went up against this one fighter, it seemed that ultimately that was the only one fighter that Billy Hope was threatened by. So we end up having it to ultimately Billy Hope goes to Tick Williams. Tick Williams ultimately offers Billy a janitor job, a night janitor job, and Billy is just kind of like, dude, I'm not going to go and clean anyone's toilets. Uh, we ultimately have it to also Billy ends up having to go to try to see his daughter, and ultimately his daughter wants nothing to really do with him eventually. Because we end up having to her. Billy is to talk to Layla, and the longer that he tries to talk with her, the more that she's basically saying that he effed up, that he like that ultimately like she doesn't really need him, and so ultimately she stops seeing him. And so eventually we have it to where Billy is also a mess and hoping seeing that his daughter will otherwise kind of change that um, ultimately makes Billy want to decide to just like, okay, well, I'm going to go and work with Wills and ultimately do the job that he had ultimately offered me. And so we end up having it to where eventually Billy ends up going and the ends up cleaning up the gym, and ultimately he ends up going and meeting a kid named Hoppy, where it seems that Billy is going to like kind of really start talking with Hoppy and kind of make friends with him. And ultimately, we eventually have it to where Tick is eventually going to train Billy and do all these like techniques and stuff along those lines, blah, 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 blah. So eventually, we have it to where Billy is to eventually go and clean himself up, not drink anymore, not ultimately do the things that ultimately they want him to do. And so ultimately, it seems that he's eventually going to win the courts over. That ultimately he's going to get eventually his daughter back, but ultimately it's just going to take a lot more time. So eventually we end up having it to where ultimately Billy is to do this job and eventually get training, and eventually we end up finding out that eventually Billy starts noticing that Hoppy is wearing the same clothes for a number of days in a row, and ultimately he ends up telling Tick about this, and so we end up finding out that Hoppy's character ends up getting killed because he ends up getting, I guess, on the wrong side of the road, or wrong side of the street, so to speak, and he ends up getting killed, which ultimately has both of them kind of mourning over Hoppy's loss. Before this, we eventually get to find that seemingly we end up having to where Billy ends up going to the bar with Tick consistently. Billy doesn't drink anything, but he just wants to not be able to go home because his entire home is empty with nothing in it. So ultimately, him just kind of talking to Tick wills ultimately is a way of him just being able to uh, just kind of avoid being home. While Tick is basically asking Billy like what are you doing? What are you doing with your life kind of thing? Like why are you here? And we end up having it to where Billy can't come up with an answer, and so he's getting severely frustrated with the fact that ultimately Tick is consistently asking this question of like, what are you gonna do? Like, what is your goal? Like, what's going on? Like, why are you here? And ultimately, Billy is just gets so frustrated that ultimately he ends up going and um, almost causing some damage upon this bar, which ultimately he goes and tries to pay for, and the bartender's like, no, 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 you're fine. We end up having it to where ultimately Billy didn't really have much of a plan. The only thing that he really decided upon was that he had to try to get his daughter back, and that ultimately he had to try and box again, and that's all that really mattered to him, and that's all he really thought of. Besides that, ultimately he's just trying to follow the bouncing ball of just ultimately saying like, okay, he's in a bind, so he needs to get out of this bind. So we end up having it to where eventually that after all of this thing is to happen, we end up having seemingly people going and wanting to find Billy Hope to ultimately say, hey, like, would you want to do a charity boxing event? And so ultimately Billy's like, oh wow, that's kind of nice that ultimately like somebody wants me and somebody wants me to be a part of their charity event. Like I don't care that I won't make any money off of this. Like I just think it would kind of be fun. So we end up having it to ultimately. Tick Wills had mentioned that he's not going to be involved with pro fighters, and ultimately we end up having after this charity fight that ultimately Billy wins. We end up having it to our Jordan Maines, who is 50 Cent. Ultimately, is to notice that it seems that Billy is in much better shape mentally and physically. And so we end up having it to where Jordan uh, ends up going to Billy and ultimately mentioning like, well, hey man, it seems like you're in much better spirits. It's like, well, hey, like, do you want to go and try and fight professionally again? It's like it seems like, hey, if you're willing to be able to want to fight again, it's like, hey, like we're gonna clear all this red tape away for you, and make it so that all the problems that you had ultimately go away, like getting his license back, having that referee ultimately not have any problems with ultimately Billy and whatever what have you, so on and so forth. So Billy is ultimately just like, well, hey, like it would be nice to fight again. And ultimately, Tick Wills is like, dude, I'm not gonna fight with you. Like, I'm not gonna train you for this pro fight. Like, no, I don't train professional fighters. And ultimately, Billy says like, well, I'm not one. I'm not a professional fighter. I'm just a fighter. And so ultimately, we end up having Billy convincing Tick that ultimately he's like, hey, man, like I'll give you my everything if ultimately you'll train me. And so you ultimately have it toward Tick Wells just ultimately says like, okay, fine, we'll train. So we end up having them train, and ultimately the entire fight is to just get Billy Hope and Escobar in the ring together. So really, that is the real true like fight that is to go on here, and so we end up having it to ultimately we end up having them train. Eventually, we end up having it to where eventually Billy is to win back his daughter, and eventually we end up having it to where his daughter is ultimately mentioning like, "Hey, like, I want to be at the fight. Like, I want to be there." And we end up having to where Billy is like, "You know what? I don't think we should do that. Your mother never wanted you to be at any of the fights." And ultimately, Layla's like, "No, I need to be there." And ultimately, Billy's just like, "Okay, fine." So we end up having it to eventually Layla is told to be in some part of the arena, told to watch it on TV instead of actually being out in the crowd. So we eventually have it to where ultimately this fight is to go on, and reasonably we have it to where ultimately it seems that it's a very close fight. It seems that at some point Escobar ends up talking smack ultimately about Billy's wife again. And so we end up having it to where Billy ends up going in this like mad dog like approach. Ultimately, Tick is trying to calm him down, and but eventually it's a very beautiful moment where eventually we get longer into these rounds where ultimately Billy is of course getting really tired, and ultimately Tick is ultimately saying like knock his out, knock his butt out. Like you need to be like Billy Hope. Yeah, you need like you need to tear him apart. You need like the real true legit like the really great way to just kind of um, really kind of rev up Billy's engine is really just awesome within this match and going on here. Ultimately, I remember the movie Warriors, the Tom Hardy movie Warriors, where we have, I think, Frank Grillo, who ultimately is telling the guy that ultimately is cage fighting, ultimately telling him, like, hey, like, if you don't win this match, you don't have a home. Like, you need to win this match for your family. Like, you need to win here, and you need to knock this guy out or tap him out. You need to do something. And so, ultimately, like, that moment with the movie Warrior, or Warriors, and I think it's either Warrior or Warriors. It's a Tom Hardy movie. Go ahead and check it out. But we end up having it to where in this scenario, like we need Billy to win because ultimately it's the right thing to do. And so ultimately we end up having it to where Billy ends up knocking Escobar out, but he doesn't stay down through the 10 count. Ultimately Escobar gets back up. So we eventually have it to where the match goes to the decision, and ultimately we end up crowning a new champion, which ultimately means Billy wins. Billy ends up going back to the back to ultimately go and uh, hug his daughter, ultimately giving the belt to Tick Williams to ultimately have like a trophy case being done for that belt. So we end up having it to where everybody, I guess, wins in the end, and ultimately Billy is to just kind of ride off in the sunset with this movie with his daughter, and things going well now for him now that he basically is able to uh, be able to get the vengeance that he needed. Ultimately, once he wins this match, he ultimately goes to the corner and ultimately somehow or another talks to Marlene, I guess, to ultimately say it's like we did it, baby, we did it. Like now I can go home. Like now, like we've done it. Like basically, it's like a story of like okay now like um, Marlene can really and truly rest because um, because Billy um, had gotten the vengeance that he needed and the ability to take down and fight his foe. Yeah, it was a decision, but when looking at it, it's still a win um, at the end of it all. So that's the thing that ultimately I can appreciate about this movie. Just kind of it's a feel good movie. I thought it would have been interesting if ultimately we would have still had it to where maybe by decision Billy still would have lost. Like it would have been interesting to see what would have happened if Billy would have lost after this. Um, like would have Billy have exploded? Would Billy have said like, well, hey, I still got what I needed out of this, and I'm still happy, and like I didn't need a belt at the end of this to um, feel like I still won this, and like you still could have had these guys still in a comeback trail, just like, well, I still want that belt. Um, I got my vengeance, but now I'm coming for that belt. Like they could have they could have really rolled this into a sequel if they were ever going to do that, which I don't think they're ever going to. But it just would have been nice. But yeah, so I really enjoy this movie, but I think other than that, I'm going to get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.